This week we saw Joe Biden project weakness, never a good look for a world leader. At his State of the Union address, he ignored the disasters that his first year has brought upon this nation and all of us. Somebody who's been following these disasters closer than anyone, somebody who's one of the smartest people we know on this show, host of Human Events Daily, Jack Posobiec. Jack, you've been following the disasters of the Biden administration one after another. What's your take on the State of the Union?
Well, Benny, it's always a pleasure to be here. And, really, as looking at the State of the Union as an American, as a citizen, as someone who's looking out at these disasters, who has a family like yourself, you're a family man. And we want to know who exactly is in charge of our country, because we all get the impression as we watch this thing that it ain't this guy who can barely finish a sentence. I mean, this was like when your iPhone is all the way at the end of the battery and it starts blinking and the signal starts going out and then it just dies and you get that flashing light. You need to plug it back in again. He could barely finish sentences. He was speeding so that he could race through without as many gaffes as possible. But it was gaffe city, gaffe after gaffe after gaffe. Didn't talk about Afghanistan, but fortunately, Representative Lauren Boebert was able to bring that up for him in our 13 honored dead from the Kabul airport. Won't talk about the fact that he cut and ran from the people of Ukraine the same way that he cut and ran from Afghanistan. And he barely even mentioned China, the 800-pound panda bear in the room, because apparently, well, I guess his son is just making too much money off of it.
So let's talk about Ukraine. No one's been covering it closer than you. Do you think that the people of Ukraine are comforted by the fact that Joe Biden thinks they're Iranian?
Yeah, I think that the people of Ukraine, if they're looking at this speech, they're going to start thinking, okay, we need to get better allies. We need to find friends elsewhere. This is not the guy that we want to be reassured for our national security from. This isn't a guy that we want doing security outside of like the local Dollar Tree. This is not somebody who projects fear, not someone who projects leadership. I mean, you could have easily had a very resolute presidential leader standing there saying, really taking up that mantle as the leader of the free world. And I know that Biden and his allies, like Chief of Staff Ron Klain, have tried to come out there and portray him as this FDR type of figure. And that's really what they were going for, trying to say, oh, we're going to stand up to Putin and treat him as if he's, the new Hitler and everything else. But it's just not working because, unfortunately, you're still dealing with Joe Biden. The material is just not there, right? The spirit is willing, but the flesh is, well, Joe Biden.
Well, yeah, that's very apropos, especially being that Joe Biden just recently wouldn't talk about his stance on abortion at the White House. Very interesting. Ash Wednesday this week. Joe Biden also breaking a number of commandments. Thou shalt not kill. Joe Biden got 13 Americans killed in Afghanistan in his disastrous and incompetent pullout of Afghanistan. Jack, you're a veteran, man, and Joe Biden didn't even mention Afghanistan or the deaths that his incompetence caused. As a veteran, I mean, obviously as a tactician politically and as somebody who really cares about this country, but as somebody who served, what does that say to you?
Well, look, in another era, you would have had maybe a gallery appearance and 13 seats, maybe 13 empty seats to signify the losses of our troops in the field during that day. Maybe some of the family members, invited there as a way to honor them, as to honor their sacrifices to our nation, as their commander in chief asked them and ordered them to be in that position. And yet we aren't that country anymore. And it really does feel that we've lost something as a country when we can't at least be honest to the American people, honest to ourselves and honest to the world about the things that are going on. Instead, we seek to hide these things. We hide the fact that we pulled out, that the 13 died. We hide the fact that what's going on in Ukraine, the absolute crisis, is because of this very same American weakness and foolish American foreign policy vis-a-vis the Ukrainians, and the same time that Joe Biden will sit there and he'll, fly a flag and wear a lapel pin, but at the same time, they're the ones who are being left in this situation.
Why would anyone sign up to serve in the armed forces right now?
Well, I do tell people that if you want to sign up for the armed forces right now, It's always a great jobs program. It's a great way to get an education. If you're looking for an education, it's a great way to get training. Sign up for something that you can get the skills that pay the bills in the private sector. Go for something like cybersecurity, go for something like IT. If you want to be a linguist, go to school for that. You can get into it. But if you're someone who's going to sign up thinking that you're going to be defending the country under this administration or under these ridiculous generals that we have, like General Milley, who are going up there talking about woke studies and the implicit origins and roots of white rage, right, and critical race theory, right, you're really not going to be going in for the right program. So I think there's a lot of good to come from the military. I do think, by the way, that conservatives in general still should be going in, because at some point we're going to have to write that institution around the same way that we're going to have to write every institution around. But that being said, go in with clear eyes and understand the situation that you're going to be getting yourself into.
Your recent reporting, Jack, states that Joe Biden's speech might have actually buoyed Russian prospects in Ukraine, may have actually had the opposite intended effects. Can you illuminate for our audience?
Yeah, so I was getting some messages during the speech, and then even we saw across Telegram channels, both pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian, that specific clip of, yes, Joe Biden did step on himself, and he said the word Iranians or Uranians or something, but he had a line just before that where he talked about Putin and Russian forces being able to encircle Kiev. Well, the problem with that is that Russian tanks have not, to this point, encircled Kiev, and Kiev is planning an extremely robust defense to try to prevent Russia from doing that. So essentially what Biden just did was completely undercut their defense efforts. They're planning for a massive potential siege or potential morale situation where they're going to have to defend their own capital city from Russian forces. But instead, Biden has essentially told them that they're going to lose and they're going to fail. So, of course, you had the pro-Russian channels after this were up there praising Biden's speech and saying that it was really an endorsement and a promotion of the Russian military operation. And then the Ukrainian channel saying, what the heck is this guy saying? We're planning to fight tooth and nail for our home, and this guy's selling us out.
It's extremely demoralizing, and watching the entire speech, it's what our first block was about, just weakness on the world stage. Our own Neville Chamberlain here. You are a defense expert, Jack, and I suppose I have a defense question for you. Do you believe that you can create a wall high enough to stop a vaccine? Is that possible from a defense perspective?
That depends, right? What kind of vaccine launcher are we talking about? Will it be a slingshot? Will it be a catapult? Perhaps some type of blow dart of some sort? Some kind of like Amazonian, blow dart kind of thing. I just don't know, but it really depends. Now, that being said, if we've got the wall with those steel slats, you might be able to get the vaccine through those if you time it properly.
Jack, thank you. I've been wondering that. I thought, wow, what a broad statement. You won't be able to build a wall high enough to stop our vaccines.
Where there's a will, there's a way. We're going to get those vaccines through that wall.
This is the kind of insight. This is why you bring Jack onto your shows. These are the kind of insightful commentary that you must have right now. It's a dangerous time. You got to know when the vaccine's coming at you and what kind of a wall you need to build to prevent yourself from getting it. Thank you, Jack.
Be careful.
All right. Thank you for joining us. Everyone follow Jack. He has an amazing show, an incredible podcast, and it is all around must follow on Twitter. Thank you, Jack.
Appreciate it, Benny. Honor to be on here.
All right. Our next guest says that the greatest threat to America is not a dictator in another country. It's our ruling class here in this country, and he's bang on with that. Christopher Bedford of The Federalist joins us next. Most of the world right now has their eyes turned on the situation in Ukraine. Rightly so. War is never a good thing. It's a terrible thing to watch, and unnecessary death and destruction, especially of civilian targets, are evil. It certainly is, and we condemn it on this show. But should we get involved as a country? Is it worth the United States going to nuclear war with another nuclear power? Our next guest says that the bigger threat in our country, perhaps in all countries, is the corrupt, corroded ruling class elites. Joining us now, senior editor at The Federalist, Christopher Bedford. Chris, always one to hit the nail on the head and to talk about the things that can't quite say, especially inside of the Washington, D.C. circles. We just saw the State of the Union, which was the greatest prom gathering of the ruling class elites in our country. What did you make of it?
Well, the State of the European Union would have been a perfectly fine name for it. I'm not exactly sure what he was going with there, but trying to tell us that, well, war is raging in Ukraine with Russian invasion and the capital city surrounded, that this is a good thing. The West is finally united because I guess the governors of Virginia and Texas ordered the Russian booze off their shelves. That's a completely ridiculous statement to make, and I don't think it's going to bear out very well. And they're facing a problem right now where they've been accusing folks like you and folks like Tucker and other people who've maybe not been so quick to jump into war, that if they don't love Biden enough and they don't hate Putin enough, then maybe they're a traitor. That's a completely insane thing. Right now, we've got a supposed call to defend the West that's coming from this president, that's coming from the Chancellor of Germany, that's coming from France, that's coming from across Europe, saying we need to defend the West. Well, just 2 weeks ago, if you remember, the West was a patriarchal and racist society with nothing redeemable. We needed to return the land to the Indians who had it before. Our border, defending our border, this border, American border, not the Ukrainian border, was racist. Truck drivers were getting their accounts frozen. Australians being thrown into detention centers for not going with the COVID rules. Children as young as 3 being forced to wear masks. Priests being arrested. Churches being shut down. This is the ruling class that we're dealing with right now, and there's very little they could say in that State of the Union that's going to convince me that Putin is a bigger threat to American freedoms than they are.
Well, the biggest threat that I can think of inside of that room is the Russian booze, vodka specifically being taken off the shelf. Nancy Pelosi has nothing to mix with, not good. We saw last night she was shaky, she was gummy, she was mouthing, she did one of these numbers, which is, everybody knows this is just classic detox. It's a real issue, Chris, and it's affecting some of the most powerful people in the country, making them even more unhinged. Does this bother you? It must concern you.
You know, I saw Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi sitting down and standing up and saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. It really reminded me of when I'm back at the Latin Mass, just trying to keep up. I always have to stand in the back because you sit down at the completely wrong times and everyone laughs at you. There was not a lot of energy in that room that we saw last night. The Democrats are not super excited. They tried to remove the mask ban, thankfully. I mean, 5 blocks away from that big party, children in D.C. are still forced to wear masks, even sometimes at recess in their schools. They got removed the mask ban. They said they could have guests. They said they could have people coming. But what accomplishments do they have to tout? They wanted to claim victory in Ukraine? That's completely insane. It's a war-ravaged country where there's very little help coming from the West, unfortunately, for them. They wanted to declare victory and build back better. Well, that's failed twice. It's the whole point of the speech is to try and get the American people to get really excited, especially the left-wing base, to come out and vote for Democrats in November. I think they've got a very hard sell on that, and they're certainly not doing it with independents.
So when it comes to the left-leaning base coming out and voting for Democrats, is the way to get that to happen to fund the police and to close the borders? This seemed like a strange tact. Have I have amnesia over the last couple of years?
It's funny you mentioned the borders, where President Biden talked about putting up new kinds of security apparatus on the borders. That's completely insane. They haven't put up any new security at the border. They've done quite the opposite there. And even if you did put in new surveillance technologies, the Border Patrol that we rely on to keep us safe, they're not able to use those surveillance technologies to arrest these migrants because they're playing babysitter to all these families that have now been brought in because of this administration's policies. You're not going to see a fact check of that in the mainstream media. Now you're going to see also Democrats, just like you said, trying to say, well, we never really were for defund the police, which is something that is extremely unpopular in every single city. Even the chairman of Washington, D.C., about 95% Democratic city, the city council is now pulling back and saying, well, maybe a 200% rise in murder over 5 years is a bad thing. Maybe we should fund the police. They're going to try and memory hole that. They're going to try and memory hole aspects of the border. They're going to try and memory hole all the COVID policies that have ruined lives, killed people, separated folks from their parents and their families, broken up churches. They're going to try and say, don't worry, we kept you safe. We have the future. We have the plan. You and I know, as refugees from D.C., that that's all hogwash.
So we did used to live around the block from each other in Washington, D.C. We worked and ran in very close circles. They're circles, you could count them on about one hand of conservatives that you can actually trust in Washington. So it's pretty small social club there. And also, don't tell me that you're not hurt a little bit by Russian vodka being off the shelf. Some of the best martinis I've ever had, made by Chris Bedford.
Absolutely is.
I digress. You saw the chaotic destruction of your neighborhood, which is a posh neighborhood close to the Capitol. I mean, truly spitting distance, as you would say in the country, to the Capitol. And you watched it descend into anarchy and third world hellscape at the hands of a Democrat uniparty in Washington. So as just a voter, not as a commentator or as a conservative or as a writer, which everyone must read Chris Bedford's writing at the Federalist, but as just a citizen trying to preserve your own life and security in society, how do you feel watching Joe Biden, the man who did all of this, sitting in front of Kamala Harris, the person who funded BLM activists out of jail and wanted their release, somebody who destroyed your neighborhood, listening to the State of the Union saying, we must fund the police?
It's absolutely enraging, and exactly right. I'm being driven from my neighborhood right now. I've lived in D.C. for 18 years, intended to raise my family here. Now I'm leaving. I met with my agent on Monday, and I looked at houses in Virginia earlier today. To see these people who are absolutely responsible for it, and they are responsible. Sometimes in politics and in the national order, it's hard to trace things, cause and effect. You have some plausible deniability. Typically, the Democrats really rely on that. They say, well, our policies didn't crash the economy. There are lots of factors. Often there are, even though their policies did that. This is one that's very different. After the summer of George Floyd, where the police were radically undercut, defunded, arrested, threatened by mobs, not backed by politicians, you saw a massive, massive, massive increase in crime all across the country. And while neighborhoods like mine are suffering, carjackings up, women afraid to pump gas, friends of mine, men afraid to pump gas, children being threatened, in the poorer neighborhoods in D.C., where a lot of the voters for the Democratic Party traditionally have been, I think that might be changing, especially some of the black neighborhoods in D.C., the crime is 10 times worse. No one's responding. No one's caring. The mainstream media will get all upset if you open up fire across from the Diplomat, Joe Biden's favorite restaurant. The CNN reporters go hide under their tables. They'll get upset if there's gunfire at National Park during a baseball game, but they don't really care when a little girl gets shot walking home with her parents, her hair styled to look like her grandmother's, shot and killed by these bandits. Those things don't cross their mind, and it's really dreadful. So as awful as it's been in our neighborhood, it's so much worse for those who have even less access.
Yeah, I mean, I clearly moved my family 1,000 miles directly to Florida. That's a true move, and I'm very happy to hear that you're moving now.
I'm out of here.
Sounds like what you just described. Sounds like what you just described is systemic racism, like as though they don't care about a certain group of people, impoverished and downtrodden, that their policies are destroying. Everybody go check out Chris Bedford's latest piece at the Federalist, skewering our elites, barbecuing them. A beautiful piece. Thank you, Chris, for being on our show.
Thanks, Benny, and let's barbecue soon.
My man. All right, last year, big tech silenced one of our strongest presidents in history, shut him down. And our next guest is helping bring him back online. That's right, building Donald Trump's social media brand and indeed a conservative internet. Martine Avila joins me next. My name is Benny Johnson, and welcome to the Benny Report. Nancy Pelosi is 82 years old. Mitch McConnell is 80 years old, and Joe Biden is 79 years old. These three people have quite a few things in common. They are perhaps the most powerful officials in America right now, sadly. The three of them have been in politics for over 100 years combined. And lastly, all of them were born during the Second World War. We bring this up not to be ageist, of course, but to illustrate that there are some important lessons from that time period that these leaders may seek to remember. They were alive during the Second World War, after all. No doubt their families suffered, many did. They should consider not making the same catastrophic mistakes that leaders at the time made. And what was the main mistake that was made by leaders during World War II. Weakness. The story is infamous. England's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, a career politician, is convinced that Hitler can be reasoned with. No one wants a war after all, he thinks, so he flies to Munich. He meets with Hitler, and he gives Hitler what he wanted, a big chunk of Czechoslovakia, a place where German-speaking people lived, land that was rightfully German, historically German, Hitler said. Land where Germany had deployed troops and began to bomb. Does that sound familiar right now? Anyone? After appeasing Hitler, Chamberlain took his peace agreement and waved it proudly in the streets. Peace in our time, he declared. The ignorant British public cheered. One man was not cheering. His name was Winston Churchill. He was so outspoken against appeasement and Hitler that Neville Chamberlain had him banned from the newspapers and broadcast television, a 1930s deplatforming, if you will. It was only after British troops began to be sent home in body bags by German soldiers that the public sentiment turned to rage. Chamberlain was cast out by his own party, and Churchill was elected prime minister. But by then it was too late. The victory was bittersweet. The bombs were already set to fall on London. When asked at his post-war trial whether German forces could have defeated a united front of allies before Neville Chamberlain's appeasement, the chief of the German army, Alfred Jodl, replied, "Out of the question." But no one stood up to Germany, and we got World War II. World War II killed 80 million human beings. That's 5% of the world's population at the time. This is the cost of weakness. Joe Biden was born during World War II, so you would think that these lessons would sink in. Appeasement and weakness is the fatal flaw that dooms a people. The first thing Joe Biden did upon entering the Oval Office is to sign his own worthless peace agreement, just like Chamberlain, approving a new gas pipeline for Russia into Europe. In the same pen stroke, he killed American energy independence with the Keystone XL pipeline. Over the next year, Biden inflated our currency, opened our borders, and got 13 American soldiers killed in Afghanistan. Weakness, weakness, weakness. Weakness has a cost. Our enemies are watching, and they see this.
Putin may circle Kyiv with tanks, but he'll never gain the hearts and souls of the Iranian people. He'll never extinguish their love of freedom. Because you can't build a wall high enough to keep out a vaccine. The vaccine can stop the spread of these diseases. Brown says it's time to bury the label Rust Belt. It's time to see what used to be called the Rust Belt become the home of a significant resurgence of manufacturing.
Famous orator Winston Churchill is spinning in his grave at an RPM unheard of watching that speech. What a disaster. The State of the Union is weak, it's feeble, and it's scared. Joe Biden is our Neville Chamberlain. Same men, different era. Both living in a fantasy mindset marked by immaturity, frivolousness, mental instability, and a feline nature that characterizes the ruling class, always has. Biden, Chamberlain, same men, same result. In times of crisis, all performative, meaningless, feminine, passive-aggressive gestures get set on fire, and all that's left is natural law, the laws of nature. They always reassert themselves. In the end, there is nothing left. There's no such thing as a power vacuum. Somebody takes power, so it better be you. You better be strong. Might does make right. The larger animal gets to eat. They get to expand their territory and influence, to do as they please. These are the laws of nature. And the real consequences of something terrible happening to you if you do not have strength is very bad. These are the driving forces that guide our world, whether you like it or not. A pack of wild animals does not choose the weakest and most diseased member to lead them. 81 million Americans chose Joe Biden, and this is literally defying nature, ladies and gentlemen. In 1940, George Orwell reviewed Hitler's book, Mein Kampf. Orwell ripped away the veneer of pacifist liberal worldview and mindset to expose something dark and alluring in human nature. His review goes like this. Nearly all Western thought since the last war, certainly all progressive thought, has assumed tacitly that human beings desire nothing beyond ease, security, and the avoidance of pain. In such a view of life, there is no room for patriotism and military virtues. Hitler, because in his own joyless mind, feels it with exceptional strength, knows that human beings don't only want comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene, birth control, and in general, common sense. They also at least intermittently want struggle and self-sacrifice, not to mention drums and flags and loyalty parades. Whereas socialism and even capitalism have said to people, I offer you a good time. Hitler says to them, I offer you struggle and danger and death. And as a result, a whole nation flings itself at his feet, end quote. George Orwell was right. And 5% of the world's population died because of it. Could have been avoided. People need more than weakness and diminished status. Those are the things Joe Biden is offering. This is our Churchillian moment, and we have a Chamberlain at the helm. We better be strong, and we better change course quickly. Our next guest is always ahead of the news cycle and will tell us what he thought of Joe Biden's State of the Union. Jack Posobiec